What is going on, guys? This is the Dead Warrior Society. I am your host, Zach Masick. Before we dive into this episode, a couple things, some housekeeping items I want to go over real quick. Firstly, huge shout out and thank you to Nate over at Valhalla VFT. He did a reactionary response sort of thing, video, if you will, to the last episode I did. I was kind of shocked. I was not expecting that to be on anybody's radar. So that was super cool. If you guys haven't checked out his channel, please go over there. I'm sure if you're watching this, you probably know of his existence and have seen some of his stuff. So go check that out. If you watched to the very end of the last episode I did, I had mentioned that I was going to do a whole series on the reconquest or the reconquista of Spain by the Christians against the Saracens or the Muslims during the early to medieval period. I promise you I'm going to get there. Just to sort of let you see behind the curtain a little bit, when I do the research for these different seasons, so I started with Greece and then I moved on around Rogers, it takes me, I would say, approximately anywhere from a month to 3 months to really get into all the information and all the details. And I'm reading contemporary sources and scholarly work. So it takes some time. So bear with me. In the meantime, I thought it'd be a lot of fun to cover down and do an analysis and leverage history, if you will, and not just modern history, but both ancient history and pre-modern history to sort of illuminate Admiral McRaven's thesis that he wrote in the 90s and into this book. It's a really cool book. I read it a few years ago, actually, and I dug it up again and sort of moved through it once more. It's called Spec Ops: Case Studies in Special Operations Warfare Theory and Practice. You can go check it out. What's cool about it actually is he actually wrote it, I think, in 1996. And so the introduction of the book, or the first chapter of the book, is really he lays out his thesis of both what special operations is and really 6 principles that every special operation mission consists of. And then the rest of the book, I should say, is a whole host, or actually just 8 case studies where he goes through in detail each operation and identifies all of these principles, as he moves forward. What's fascinating is he doesn't just, it's these 6 principles. And again, this is sort of the foundation of his entire argument, is it doesn't really matter what force you're talking about or what time period or what equipment they had available to them, as we're going to go into in this episode, so long as the assaulting team, the operational team, fulfills all of these 6 principles, they will indeed succeed, or at least the likelihood of success will significantly increase. So the way I want to start this episode, I'm going to do what he does in the book, actually. He begins with the JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, definition of what special operations is. And then after that, he provides his definition as a sort of response, if you will. And you'll see he condenses his definition way down. And it's actually quite fascinating. And I think gives us a lot of insight to what he actually thinks special operations is and is not. So here's the JSOC definition, quote, special operations are defined as, quote, operations conducted by specially organized, trained, and equipped military or paramilitary forces to achieve military, political, economic, or psychological objectives by unconventional military means in hostile, denied, or politically sensitive areas. These operations are conducted during peacetime, competition, conflict, and war, independent or in coordination with the operations of conventional, non-special operations forces. Political military considerations frequently shape special operations, requiring clandestine, covert, or low visibility techniques and oversight at the national level. Special operations in the degree of physical or political risk, operational techniques, modes of employment, independence from friendly support, and dependence on detailed operational intelligence and indigenous assets. End quote. So there's a ton there to unpack. I'm not really going to go into it because I'm less concerned with what JSOC's definition is. The only thing I want you to take away from that huge definition is it's very, very broad. They are painting a very broad brush. It's very inclusive, I think, is a word I would use, quite honestly. And McRaven is kind of hilarious. Admiral McRaven's response to all this is he's kind of like, no, special operations is really just one thing. It's very specific. McRaven consolidates his definition and says this, quote, a special operation is conducted by forces specially trained, equipped, and supported for a specific target whose destruction, elimination, or rescue, in the case of hostages, is a political or military imperative. Now, like I said, McRaven admits that basically what he's just describing here is a direct action mission, which it is. And he says this to sort of back up what he's trying to do here. Quote, my definition is not consistent with official joint doctrine, which broadly defines special operations to include psychological operations, civil affairs, and reconnaissance. The 8 combat operations I analyzed to determine the principles of special operations and to develop the theory are more closely aligned to what Joint Pub 3-05 defines as a direct action mission, end quote. My read on this is I think at least at this moment in his career, he would essentially roll his eyes at most other missions that the military deemed to be special operations. And he was very subtly just saying like, no, actually, the only true special operations mission is the direct action mission. I'm not, by the way, so I don't necessarily agree with that. I think special operations missions are very complicated. In fact, one of the ways, and this is kind of why I'm doing this episode, just sort of a sidebar real quick. Part of my frustration as I was coming up through the ranks when I joined the military, it was really difficult to get a pulse on what special operations was and what it was not. And the best way I could describe it to anybody is kind of the same way you know when you're seeing porn, which is you know it when you see it, is kind of the line. I challenge you, if you were in special operations, if you have a friend that was in special operations or isn't, call them up and say, hey, I want you to very specifically give me a definition of what special operations is. I promise you they are going to struggle. Okay, plowing ahead. One of the things I want to note as well, and like I said, I'm not going to use his case studies. I'm going to use my own case studies, but there's uniformity. So essentially all of the examples that he brings up that he studied for his thesis, they were all situations where there was a small commando unit of assaulters, if you will, and they, for any number of reasons, decided that they had to go raid or assault a structure or a compound. And in every single situation, the raiders were going up against a much larger, more robust force. So more men, more firepower, and also because they're in a defensive position, they have the clear advantage. And so the only way in which this team of special operations guys could overcome this challenge was, again, by utilizing these 6 principles and one other thing that he sprinkles in the beginning, which we're going to go into, I promise. But I'm kind of repeating myself, but throughout each and every one, as we shall see, if these principles were used, which indeed they were, the team was successful regardless of time, place, location, time period, whether it was the 18th century or the 20th century. McRaven says this about it, quote, no soldier would argue the benefit of superior numbers. But if that were the most important factor, how could 69 German commandos have defeated a Belgian force of 650 soldiers protected by the largest, most extensive fortress of its time, the fort of Ibn Emil? How could a special operations force that has inferior numbers and the disadvantage of attacking the stronger form of warfare gain superiority over the enemy? To understand this paradox is to understand special operations. McRaven is very gently disagreeing with Karl von Clausewitz in his book on war. He suggests that the military force that has more personnel, has more firepower, has better techniques on the battlefield is going to defeat their enemies every single time. And McRaven is essentially highlighting the fact that if you actually go back and look at history, there are these really incredible moments where specific armies can deploy commando units, these small contingents, and defy and overwhelm the enemy in ways that we traditionally would never have believed were possible. Certainly Karl von Clausewitz probably, again, was not aware of their existence, because I don't know if there were commandos back then, but there were, because I'm going to prove it. Anyways, okay, let's go. Before we get into the 6 principles of special operations, The first thing we need to discuss is a concept that McRaven refers to as relative superiority. To put it simply, RS, or relative superiority, is when the commando force, the smaller raiding force, gains a tactical advantage over the superior enemy, which is, again, in a defensive posture. This is a critical task to every special operations mission. McRaven says, quote, relative superiority is a condition that exists when an attacking force, generally smaller, gains a decisive advantage over a larger force. Now, there are three major components with relative superiority. First, relative superiority comes at a pivotal moment of the engagement. So it's not like you can gain relative superiority at any time during the mission. And I would say 99% of the time, you have to gain RS almost from the outset of the operation, like within the few minutes. And when you look at all these missions that we're going to go through here in the case studies, you'll see, I think every single time, that the raiding force, the assaulting force, gains RS very, very quickly. So a great example of this, in 1760, Robert Rogers, towards the end of the French-Indian War, he was on operations, sort of behind enemy lines, if you will, with a small Ranger contingent. They identified a French garrison called Saint Therese or Saint Teresa. Anyways, I can't pronounce it because I don't speak fucking French. And it was situated on a river, and then around the garrison was a small village that basically supported the French fort, which was totally common during this period. And the fort was used essentially as a staging ground to plan and maintain supply lines, as well as house French allies and French soldiers. So Robert Rogers says, hey, let's go see if we can attack this thing and take it over. Now, obviously, the fort itself was manned by a quite a robust defensive force. When they arrived, Rogers conducted a reconnaissance of the fort, and what he discovered was that the demeanor of the French soldiers within was completely relaxed. He could tell almost immediately that the last thing that these guys were expecting was not only an attack, but a special operations assaulting team raiding the garrison. So what Rogers decided, basically went back to his men, and he positioned them in strategic locations where they were close enough to the fort that they could manage getting there rather quickly, but at the same time, they didn't set off any alarm bells. What was happening at this time? French soldiers were moving in and out of the main entrance of the fort with carts full of straw as used for fodder for livestock and horses. And as they were moving in and out, Rogers basically said, hey, essentially what we're going to do here is we're just going to bum rush the main gate, the main entrance, when they're least expecting it. And that's exactly what he did. When he decided was the opportune moment, he triggered the raid, and they literally ran in through the front door and within minutes achieved relative superiority and completely took the fort and essentially caught the French soldiers defending the garrison with their pants around their ankles. And not a single shot was fired, and they ended up taking somewhere in the ballpark of 76 prisoners. 28 of those were, in fact, French soldiers, and they let the rest of them go. And they ended up destroying the entire garrison, the village around it, and killed all the livestock as a point of undermining the French army's capabilities within that area. Now, just to reinforce the point with relative superiority, Robert Rogers was able to achieve relative superiority within the first minute or two of the raid because he acted so charismatically, so boldly, and so aggressively. The French did not have a moment to respond or really react in any way, shape, or form, and they were forced to surrender. There's another component of relative superiority, and that is once it is achieved, once you sort of have that advantage, you have to keep the momentum going. You cannot get bogged down. You cannot get stopped. Any loss of momentum essentially allows the enemy to obviously reposition themselves and prepare to receive you. And once they start to mobilize themselves and position themselves in such a way where they can utilize their superior firepower against the assaulting force, at that point, you're basically toast. and the likelihood of mission success just plummets. And finally, and this kind of goes with what I was saying before, the third and sort of final principle of relative superiority is that once you lose it, once you lose RS, once you lose that advantage and that momentum, getting it back is nearly impossible. So for the guys who have been in the military, have been in special operations, gone to ranger school, maybe downrange, you've done some of this stuff. If you've ever been on an objective, you start the mission, you hit the objective, you're cooking with gas, you're cruising, and then all of a sudden something happens, right? Someone trips or you get stuck in a doorway because, you know, whatever, your breaching tools aren't working properly, or the guy using the breaching tools or the explosives, he doesn't know what the fuck he's doing. That loss of momentum, you can like feel it. It like makes you want to vomit, because you know on the other side of that wall or somewhere on the compound that you're raiding, there's an enemy force who is all of a sudden alerted to your presence, right? You've lost the surprise, the element of surprise, and now they're preparing to receive you, and getting that momentum back is almost impossible. And so essentially conclusively, if you lose RS at any point during the mission, if you were to follow it, track it on a chart, the likelihood of your failure significantly increases, or I should say the likelihood of success significantly decreases. McRaven conclusively states this, quote, "The key to a special operations mission is to gain relative superiority early in the engagement. The longer an engagement continues, the more likely the outcome will be affected by the will of the enemy, chance, and uncertainty, the factors that compromise the frictions of war." He also notes chiefly that relative superiority, quote, "requires the intervention of courage, intellect, boldness, and perseverance, or what Clausewitz calls the moral factors." Now, again, just to double down, relative superiority is directly interconnected, as we shall see, with the 6 principles of special operations. Okay, I misplaced my hat and I needed an energy boost. So, of course, here we go. All right, just one final sort of recap on relative superiority. Relative superiority is simply when an assaulting team that is much smaller than the defending force is able to overcome their enemy and gain a tactical advantage utilizing speed, surprise, violence of action. Typically, there are certain rules that come with relative superiority. It happens usually in the beginning of an engagement. If you lose relative superiority, it is almost impossible to get it back, and you really need to continue that aggression and that momentum throughout the entire operation in order to be successful. One thing that I wanted to mention as well that Admiral McRaven actually doesn't bring up: if a team gets bogged down, it loses that momentum. One of the best ways, if not one of the only ways, you can gain relative superiority back is to overwhelm them with violence. One of my favorite examples of this is actually in the movie Heat. Spoiler alert. In the last bank robbery scene, as they are loading back up into the car, they still have relative superiority up until the point where all of the LAPD has now surrounded them on the block, and Val Kilmer's character just goes to town. He just selector switch full auto and just starts laying down the hate. And in order to get out of that situation, because clearly they're surrounded and they cannot bring the same amount of firepower that the LAPD could, but the way they got out of that and the way they continue that RS momentum is by just being absolutely vicious, full auto in every direction. My son is trying to break in. Okay, McRaven's 6 principles include, start to finish, simplicity, security, repetition, surprise, speed, and purpose. Again, McRaven simply created a thesis around these concepts, and it doesn't matter which special operations missions you study throughout history, and really specifically like 21st, 20th century history, but that's not, I would disagree with that, actually. You see these principles leveraged and utilized in order for the special operations team to have mission success. Now, if the team does not implement all of these rules, the likelihood of them succeeding dramatically decreases. Yeah, dramatically decreases. Sorry, I keep messing up success and failure here. simultaneously, one of the reasons why, if you ignore one of these principles, there is a very good chance that you lose relative superiority. Once you lose relative superiority, as we've discussed, the mission is lost. Simplicity, at the end of the day, which is the first principle, but McRaven actually argues it is the most important principle, and paradoxically, it is the most difficult to achieve or accomplish. He has a few strategies to keep the mission simple, and that is to limit the number of objectives you have. You must have good intelligence. And finally, the third sort of pillar of simplicity is using creativity and innovation. For some reason, I will never fully understand. I don't know if it's a special operations thing or just a human thing. People inherently believe that if you are being innovative or you're being creative, whatever you're doing, if you're making something, if you're coming up with a concept or an idea or a strategy, if it's innovative, it must therefore be complicated. And I've seen this over and over and over again in the military, and this is simply not the case. So let's go back to our Robert Rogers example. He could have taken the fort or attempted to take the fort in any number of ways, right? He could have very easily gone to his team, like, all right, check it out, guys. You guys over here, you're going to go build ladders, and then you guys are going to go over there, and we're going to wait till nightfall, and you're going to start a fire, and the fire is going to go up, and then when you see the fire, that's going to distract the French guards, and then when that happens, you're going to take the ladders, and you're going to put them up against the wall, the exterior of the fort, and you're going to climb over the fort, and that's how we're going to get into the fort. That would be like a very, in my opinion, stereotypical, like soft bro way of approaching the fort. And instead, he got good intelligence. He saw that the French force was very relaxed. He got a pattern of life, seeing these guys come to and from the fort, moving through the front gate, presumably unarmed. And he was like, yo, we're going to go through the front door. They'll never expect it. It's so aggressive. It's so bold. There's no way they're going to know this is happening. And by the way, by the time they even realize what's going on, we're going to be right on top of them. And it worked beautifully. I want to give you a counterbalance to this. A great example of what, actually kind of a modern example of what the opposite of simple mission planning is. In the 2010s, there was this concept or this idea called village stability operations. Another way of referring to it, as we often did, was VSO. And in theory, on paper, it looks like a great idea. It looks like a very down the line special forces mission where you basically send these teams. And the grand sort of idea was we would send an ODA into each one of these villages in this very sort of rural area of Afghanistan throughout the country. And they would embed themselves with these locals, these natives, and start essentially a grassroots movement, creating friction between the villages and the Taliban, and loosening up and fostering relationships with not just special forces teams and ODAs, but the United States with the local Afghan people. Unfortunately, if you're unaware, this was a complete disaster of a plan. Simply not because the plan itself was not thoughtful, but because the way in which they attempted to implement it, or lack thereof. So they essentially told ODAs, hey, you're going to go do village stability operations. We're not going to tell you what that is. Yes, we have books about what specifically we are talking about when we say village stability operations. And there's sort of steps that you take, but we're not going to explain any of that to you. And you're only going to go for 6 to 7 months. And what we need you to do is we need you to secure the area, deny Taliban their capacity to influence locals. So, disrupt their freedom of movement within your AO. And then you're going to build and foster relationships and build rapport with local elders, identify the local elders. You're going to support and bolster their local governance, because these areas were so rural, they had no real continuity with the centralized Afghan government. So they needed to have a more robust local government sort of element or body, if you will. And then you are going to help with other sorts of socioeconomic infrastructure. We're going to have farming plans where we're going to get them to go away from drugs. And I remember seeing all these signs of like families on billboards growing grain instead of marijuana. It was bizarre. And then on top of it, you're going to recruit, identify, vet, and recruit locals who can be a part of your sort of paramilitary police force. And they're going to be the ones who are going to police the area to ensure the Taliban can't come in and do anything. And then if you can't, it also is like set up med caps and make schools. And that'll help you sort of build and foster those relationships all at the same time. If this sounds fucking insane, it's because it was. There is no way in hell you could send an ODA to a small rural Afghan village where they fundamentally don't really understand the culture or the people and secure the area from the Taliban. That's going to take a year, if not longer. And then you can start to foster relationships and maybe begin to map out what the governance looked like. At that same time, as you're engaging with the locals, maybe you can start to identify individuals who may be a good fit for your paramilitary police force. Anyways, all that is to say, it was a complete disaster zone. And essentially what happened was it was so complicated. There were so many things that the commanders were expecting from each individual ODA for them to be able to get done in that 6 to 7 month stretch. Also, by the way, there was no continuity between the teams. So, for example, you would send an ODA in to replace a team that was obviously already out there. And that team that was there was like, hey, we've just been targeting IED emplacement guys, getting a pattern of life, and then shooting them in the face. We don't really like to talk to the locals. The area is pretty secure. This guy are important, but again, we haven't talked to them in a month. Have fun. You could see how it's no surprise this entire strategy was a complete failure. And like I said, the reason for that more than likely is because there was no simplicity to it. None whatsoever. And granted, yes, it wasn't a direct action mission, right? Obviously, I would still deem it, like I said, this is where I sort of maybe break off from McRaven. I would still argue that VSO certainly was within the vein of a special operations mission. Okay, plowing ahead. As I said earlier, good intelligence, you have to have good intelligence in order to have a simple plan. McRaven states this, quote, good intel simplifies a plan by reducing unknown factors and the number of variables that must be considered. So I sort of am repeating myself, but one of the reasons why Robert Rogers knew he could bum rush the front gate is simply because when he did his reconnaissance, he gained real-time intelligence that said, hey, these French guys, there's guys sleeping over here. They clearly don't give a shit. None of them are armed. They're totally relaxed. Their demeanor is soft. We will have no problem just coming in here and taking over. So good intel. And then we've already sort of discussed simplicity and creativity. Another really good example of this that I sort of want to mention, if you haven't watched any of my Spartan episodes, you don't have to have watched them to get this, but I'm going to have to repeat some stuff. So, but if you enjoy this, yeah, go check them out. There was a Spartan during the Peloponnesian War named Brasidas, and he was a bit of a rogue commander. And what he wanted to do was go and conduct a UW, unconventional warfare campaign against the Athenians in northern Greece. At this point, during the Peloponnesian War, they were basically at a stalemate. They would kind of go tit for tat, the Athenians and the Spartans and all of their partners. And so he convinced the Ifrit, the Spartan government body, that he was allowed to go do this. Instead of sending a group or contingent of actual Spartans, they funded him a little bit, and he was able to raise an army made up of predominantly Peloponnesian mercenaries, as well as 700 freed helots. He was also able to get some funds from the Macedonian king at that time, who was way off into the north. Anyways, one of the key objectives was for him to take the city called Amphipolis. Amphipolis, for those of you who didn't watch the other episode, it was a major Greek city in the north. It had been essentially taken over and was aligned with the Athenians, but it was a major hub for men, materials, supplies, all that good stuff that you need to fight a war up in the north. And if the Spartans could take it, it would seriously cripple the Athenian economy and their capacity to transport any of their goods, whether that's for the civilian population and that sort of market economy, as well as the war engine. But there's a problem. He doesn't have siege engines, and he somehow has to take over this city. In the ancient world, very, very often, I would say 99% of the time, if you decide you were going to take a city, you need a huge army that is well supplied, that can basically surround the city and wait them out until they get sick and they get hungry and they surrender. Brasidas doesn't have that. He has a paramilitary force at best, some professional soldiers, some non-professional soldiers. And so he has to figure out a way to get in the city. And what he ends up doing is he is able to connect and communicate with partisan spies, essentially, within Amphipolis that are friendly to the Spartans. He meets up with them, and one of them basically says, hey, I can Trojan war horse you through this back gate area, and that's going to get you and a small contingent of your guys into the city. And then once you guys are in the city, the Athenians are not expecting you to come through the gate, and we can go open the gate and get the rest of your army in. And that's exactly what he does. And they were kind of similar, not so dissimilar from Rogers, except they kind of used the back door instead of the front door. He was able to leverage partisans, which again, if you read Greek history, like never happens, at least not up until this point. Uses this spy network. And if you are familiar with UW, a lot of this should sound, like I said, familiar, and is able to infiltrate the city. They end up opening the door, and by the time the Spartans come in and the Athenian garrison that is stationed there realize what is going on, they can't react. They're overwhelmed. Even though, by the way, the Athenians outnumbered the Spartans that were in the city, the Spartans had essentially set themselves up within the city to be in the most advantageous position. So essentially, the innovation here is, hey, instead of building ladders and siege engines and trying to get more money and surround the city, because while we're doing all that, the Athenians are just going to reinforce their garrison, and we're going to lose the battle at the end of the day. So how do we get in the city? Well, we use a spy network to get us in the back door. Okay, security. Security largely has to do with operational security. I'm not really going to spend too much time on security. I will say if the enemy is alerted of the possibility of assault, clearly their defense posture is going to go through the roof, and therefore the likelihood of the success of the mission is going to be seriously diminished. Admiral McRaven's states this, quote, "The purpose of a tight security is to prevent the enemy from gaining an advantage through foreknowledge of the impending attack." So one of my favorite examples of operational security. Before the raid on St. Francis, for those of you who didn't watch the episode, the pinnacle, the height of Robert Rogers' career was when he took a company size element of Rangers and provincials and some light infantry guys, and they invaded Canada and raided an enemy village, military installation, whatever you want to call it. They'd been planning this operation for years. And essentially, we know that Robert Rogers, or historians have deduced, that Robert Rogers and his closest confidant, Lieutenant John Stark, who had become a general, by the way, in the Revolutionary War, they had been planning this operation for a very long time. And they had proposed it to leadership a few times. It had been shut down. Finally, they got the green light. They launched for the mission, and Rogers didn't even tell the company of Rangers as they're infilling into Canada to conduct this raid. They didn't even know where they were going. And finally, when they arrived at this location called Missisquoi Bay, which was essentially like the point of no return, Rogers briefed his men, and he said, "Hey, by the way, we are going to go raid St. Francis." The reason, I know you're wondering, like, well, there was no fucking computers, there was no signal chat. You can't text your buddies back in the mid 18th century. Why were they so worried about operational security? Well, even back then, there was a huge problem of information getting leaked from these forts that are indeed in the wilderness back to major urban cities. And then you've got newspapers that are getting printed every day. And literally a lot of the information we have about this time period and all the details come from soldiers passing information on to reporters and journos in Philadelphia, in New Amsterdam, and they're writing these papers. And literally there was actually multiple reports, I can't remember what paper it was, reporting that Robert Rogers, who was very popular at the time, was on some mission and no one knew where he was going. So obviously, had the location, had people known or had a reporter known that they were going to go raid St. Francis, the French would have very likely been alerted to that, and then they would not have succeeded. One of the security is interconnected, McRaven suggests, with the next piece, the next principle, which is repetition. Repetition is sort of a catch-all word for training and rehearsals. Again, for those of you who were in the military, you know exactly what I'm talking about. A great example of rehearsals, very specific rehearsals, is the fact that when or prior to the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound, the dev group or the unit that was going to go conduct the raid, they actually built a compound based off of whatever intelligence they could get their hands on. And so those guys, assaulters, could actually practice what the raid would be like, where they would go, who would be where, and what jobs would happen when they got on the objective. And the whole concept, I mean, it's kind of obvious, right? It's the same reason actors rehearse scenes before a movie, because when you get to the big show, when you get on target, you don't want it to be the first time that you've actually done these actions. Also, McRaven points out that the more training you do, the more repetitions you do, the more calm you are typically on target. Many things have just sort of become muscle memory at this point. And simultaneously, if there are any hiccups or major mistakes, which there almost always seems to be the case when you're doing this type of stuff, it is much easier to overcome those obstacles, continuing that relative superiority momentum if you've done your rehearsals and if you've done your training. Security is, he talks about this a little bit, is interlocked with repetition. As you go out and you're doing this training or rehearsals for a very specific operation, that is very often when an enemy can detect that you are going to go do some kind of mission or operation, and therefore it is critical that during rehearsals, during training, you maintain a high level of operational security. McRaven concludes this, quote, repetition by its very nature improves speed on target, which of course gets us into speed. Repetition facilitates speed, and speed can only be accomplished if the mission is simple. It all kind of makes sense, right? If there's a bunch of friction, or your frictions of war, as McRaven likes to talk about it, there's too many moving parts. It slows you down. You lose relative superiority. You again, the likelihood that you will succeed diminishes greatly. McRaven argues, quote, the Fleet Marine Force Manual states, quote, as with all things in war, speed is relative. However, McRaven disagrees, and he says, quote, this statement by FM 1-3 may be true in conventional or large-scale warfare, where the forces on the battlefield maneuver and adjust to certain tactical advances, but in special operations, the enemy is in a defensive position, and his only desire is to counter your attack. Therefore, the enemy's will to resist is a given, and his ability to react is constant, and not against the enemy. It is therefore essential to move as quickly as possible, regardless of the enemy's reaction. McRaven goes on to note that the concept of speed is rather simple. He says, quote, the team must get to the objective as fast as possible. This is what I was talking about before with relative superiority. In order to gain RS, you have to be fast. And I guess I repeat myself, usually you get that foothold in the very beginning of the engagement because you were fast, you surprised the enemy, and if need be, you were violent as fuck. Paradoxically, to sort of what the Marine Corps FM was stating, the only way to gain both speed and surprise is by utilizing or deploying a small team. Right? It's almost impossible, if not nearly impossible, to have the element of surprise and be able to leverage and utilize speed if you have these huge forces or if your force is just too large. Okay, finally, we have purpose. This one, when I read this, I never heard of purpose before. I think I've heard of some leaders or commanders trying to talk about purpose here and there, but it never really got nailed down. And in my opinion, purpose is very often overlooked by modern soft operations and operators and leaders. And McRaven suggests, quote, purpose is understanding and then executing the prime objective of the mission, regardless of emerging obstacles or opportunities. Ensuring that your team not only understands the purpose, but believes in the purpose is absolutely critical, because in every one of these operations, something goes wrong. Shit hits the fan. It doesn't go the way you had originally planned or trained for. And basically, McRaven's argument is if the team's purpose is not aligned, when things go wrong, the likelihood of failure significantly goes up. So a great example of this in our sort of Robert Rogers case study, when he was infilling to go raid St. Francis, all kinds of shit went sideways. Within a few days, a quarter of his force, so he had roughly 190 to 200 rangers, provincials, different types of soldiers in his company, nearly a quarter got ill and sick. A couple guys were wounded, and all these guys had to return to base, or they had to RTB. So think of that. Think, you're 2 or 3 days into your infill. This operation is going to probably last 4 weeks. You need a certain number of guys. I'm sure Rogers had like a no shit, if we don't have 100 and X amount of, 120 guys, we can't do the operation. And within the first few days, you lose a bunch of guys. If his purpose wasn't aligned, right? If he wasn't focused and his men's purpose wasn't aligned with, hey, this is what we're here to do. If we don't have all the guys, so be it. We're gonna drive on. Then they were discovered by the French. They had moved behind enemy lines. Scouts had told them, hey, Major Rogers, the French know we're coming. They don't know specifically where we are at this moment, but they're hunting for us, right? Another hurdle. Now imagine if their purpose was not aligned. Imagine if the Rangers, were not 100% dedicated to not only Robert Rogers, but the mission. There could have been mutiny. The guys could have started to abandon the mission. It could have just all disintegrated and fallen apart very, very quickly, but it didn't. And if you want more details on this operation, just go watch the episode. It's I don't know, it's like 3 episodes back. But the point that I'm really trying to make here is, because their purpose was integrated into their heads of this is what we are fucking doing, and there's no turning back. When problems came up, there was no hesitation. The mission, they just drove on. Hey, we got something to do. Let's go fucking do it. McRaven suggests, quote, the purpose of the mission must be thoroughly understood beforehand, and the men must be inspired with a sense of personal dedication that knows no limits, end quote. And this is without a doubt, for sure, how the men felt that were underneath Robert Rogers. There is a SS captain who does a commando mission to recover the fascistic dictator Mussolini during World War II. And it's like I said, it's one of the case studies that McRaven uses, that he analyzes. And this is a quote from the captain. He says, quote, when a man is moved by pure enthusiasm and by the conviction that he is risking his life in a noble cause, he provides the essential elements for success. Karl von Clausewitz notes in his treatise on war, he sort of supports all of these concepts and ideas. Quote, theorists are apt to look on fighting in the abstract as a trial of strength without emotion entering into it. This is one of 1,000 errors which they quite consciously commit because they have no idea of the implications, end quote. Men and soldiers are emotional animals. I mean, humans are constantly driven by any number of variables, both internal and external. A motivated special operations team or force that is fully aware, and they, coupled with the fact that they believe in their purpose, are a deadly and very effective and very efficient force, and very, more often than not, will stop at nothing to achieve their goals, despite whatever hurdles they face. CC Black Hawk down. Okay, in closing, one things I want to just sort of mention here, McRaven fundamentally disagrees with the idea that conventional forces can use these principles, mainly because they go right up against what he refers to as the frictions of war. Essentially, if you have one too many units or groups or parties that are trying to accomplish a military goal, it just causes there's too much lag time, there's too much bloat, and essentially they can't have relative superiority, they can't achieve speed, they can't really have very often achieve the element of surprise. And so therefore these six principles really only work for special operations forces. Just to sort of give you an example, when we were invading Iraq, we used infantry, mechanized infantry, artillery, aircraft, tanks. When you're utilizing all of these different groups in concert with one another, it's this slow, lethargic, loud, overt war machine that is coming at you. And therefore, essentially, McRaven just says it's impossible. You can't use these principles with conventional forces. He says, quote, large forces are more susceptible to the frictions of war. The principles of special operations work because they seek to reduce warfare to its simplest level and thereby limit the negative effects of chance, uncertainty, and the enemy's will. Okay, that's all I got for you guys today. Again, the book is Spec Ops Case Studies in Special Operations Warfare Theory and Practice by William McRaven. You can get it on Amazon. It's, like I said, it's a pretty easy read. It's a fun read. And anyways, I hope you enjoyed it. And like I said, hopefully I can get the Reconquest of Spain to you next time. I am Zach Masick. This is the Dead Warrior Society. We'll see you next time, guys. Deuces.